listening to Radio Maria, and we're going over now to Father Toby, who is going to be speaking to Reverend Father Dr. Michael Ward. Father Toby?
Thank you very much. Well, lovely to be with you all today, and it's a great pleasure to have in the studio Father Michael Ward, who was a teacher of mine when I was at Blackfriars in Oxford, and he gave us a course. He was brought in to do the course on apologetics, which in an overly humble style he said he wasn't qualified to do, and he did it entirely on C.S. Lewis' imaginative apologetics, and it was an absolutely fantastic course. So I hope you get a glimpse into that. Sadly, when I was at Oxford, I wasn't as into C.S. Lewis as I am now, so I feel like I'm making up for lost time. I'm not going to say too much about Father Michael, because like most really interesting people, what he has to say is more interesting than his biographical details. But he does a lot of teaching in the US. He's perhaps most famously published the book Planet Narnia, which a very picky priest from my community told me to tell you he's thoroughly enjoying. So if you get this particular priest's imprimatur, you're doing very well. That unlocks the cosmology of the Narnia novels, and he teaches also at Blackfriars Hall. So, Father Michael, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Toby. Good to be with you.
In my homily today at Mass, I was talking to the congregation, and I was saying that we need to sort of get out of the swamp in some ways. I mentioned Eurovision last night, and the fact that people would be better listening to an interview on C.S. Lewis and the way that C.S. Lewis sort of enlivens and sets free the imagination. And I just wondered, if to begin with, if you could just say a little bit about your experience of C.S. Lewis as a child, and how that led to you now being the C.S. Lewis scholar that you are today.
Yeah, I got into C.S. Lewis the same way probably most people do, by having the Narnia books read to me when I was a kid. And it's a very fond childhood memory I have, actually, of jumping into our parents' bed, our regular routine on a Sunday. And I did a short undergraduate thesis on him for my English degree, as a result of which, after I graduated, I was asked to give a one-off lecture on Lewis, and then a short course of tuition, and then a bit more teaching and a bit of writing. And I ended up living in Lewis's house, where he'd lived for half his life, where he died, the Kilns, on the east side of Oxford. Lived there for 3 years, had his bedroom as my bedroom and his study as my study, and I was the kind of warden and resident looker after of the house. And so when it came time for me to do my own doctorate, C.S. Lewis was the obvious topic, because I was already fairly familiar with his works. You might even say fairly expert, even though I hadn't formally studied him in any great depth. So I did my PhD on Lewis's theological imagination, and halfway through that course of research, I had a brainwave about Narnia, which led to this book that you mentioned, Planet Narnia. By the way, I'm very interested, perhaps afterwards you'll tell me who this picky priest is, who nonetheless is prepared to say my book's worth reading. I'll be very interested to know who that might be.
I'm not sure I should reveal who I've described as my brothers as picky in their taste. But he might not be listening anyway, so Father Thomas. I'll give his first name. But yeah, he's thoroughly enjoying it. I'm afraid to say I haven't read the full Planet Narnia yet. I've read the sort of the cheats guide, the shorter version that you did to it. But it's made me realise that I really do want to read the longer, more grown up and scholarly work. But on the subjects of sort of grown up, I having read the Chronicles of Narnia for the first time as an adult recently, just after Christmas. I started when I was young reading The Magician's Nephew, having, I think, watched the BBC adaptation of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And I started The Magician's Nephew, and I just never really got into it. And I know that you're one of a group of people who would say, well, that's because you didn't start in the right place. Can you say something about that sort of debate that goes on and why you're right?
Yeah, you didn't start at the beginning, Toby. That's why you didn't get into it. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is the first book that Lewis wrote, and it's the first book that was published. And therefore, it takes particular pains to introduce readers to the world of Narnia and to the chief character, Aslan, this Christ-like lion. The Magician's Nephew was actually the sixth book to be published, the sixth out of 7. And so when it came out in 1955, Lewis knew that many of his readers, perhaps most of his readers, were already familiar with the Narnia world and with Aslan, so he didn't take any particular effort to introduce it or him. The Magician's Nephew is more like a prequel or a flashback. It's like the Star Wars films. You start actually with number 3, don't you, or 4 in Star Wars, and then you get the original trilogy after the fact. And that's how it should be with Magician. Don't read it first. Read it in the place it was originally published, number 6, and then it works. And you get some nice effects, actually, if you read it 6th, because you suddenly hear about, oh, this is where the wardrobe came from. But if you haven't yet read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, you don't know what this wardrobe is at all. So that effect is completely lost. And there are many other reasons why you should not read Magician's Nephew first. But that's enough to be going on with. And I don't know any serious scholar who thinks otherwise, except on the basis of C.S. Lewis's own letter that he wrote to a young kid who, having read all the books, wrote a letter to Lewis and said, "Oh, thank you for the Narnia Chronicles. I like to read them now in this order." And this child starts out with Magician and then goes through in Narnian history in that chronological sense, from Genesis creation story all the way through to the Last Judgment in the Last Battle. And Lewis wrote back to this boy and said, "Oh yes, what a good idea. I like that." Never knowing that this letter would be preserved and published and then held up in evidence against him as proof as to why you should start with The Magician's Nephew. It was only one of 100 letters that he dashed off before breakfast that morning, and he was just being encouraging to this boy. I think if he genuinely thought the series should be started with The Magician's Nephew, then he was just wrong.
Yeah. Well, I guess part of the evidence is I started at The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe this time, and I made it through all the way in pretty short time, and thoroughly enjoyed them and got a lot of material for homilies out of them. And I was so enthused that to my godchildren for Christmas I gave them each I gave one's got into Tolkien, and I gave him the Hobbit, and then I gave the other one the box set of the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. But my cousin, who, if he's listening, yes, Jeremy, I am shaming you. But he said, "Oh, what are you doing? Like giving him that? These books are like for youngsters. There's no point in them." And I sort of argued against that, but I'm not sure I did a particularly good job. And so I wonder what you would say in defense of reading sort of fairy tales as an adult, because obviously C.S. Lewis thought there was a point in it, because in that rather touching sort of note that he writes to, I think, Lucy Barfield, he says that you one day you might be old enough to appreciate it, and we go through this difficult teenage patch where nothing's cool whatsoever. But why read books that seem to have been written for children as an adult, and why study them as an academic?
Well, the Narnia books are not written for children in the sense that they are beneath adult attention. This is Lewis's own verdict on the books. He said he was writing for children only in the sense that he excluded things he thought they wouldn't like or understand, not in the sense of writing things which were purely juvenile or puerile. The fairy tale genre is a universal genre. If you look at the history of it, it only became sort of unfashionable in literary circles at a certain period, and it sort of gravitated to the nursery, Lewis says, in the same way that unfashionable furniture gravitates to the nursery. You don't want to throw it out completely, but you just relegate it to, a dusty upstairs room where the children can scribble on it. But if you think of a fairy tale like, say, The Emperor's New Clothes, the emperor is supposedly, allegedly dressed in all this finery, but actually he's been tricked into wearing nothing at all. And it's only the kid on the pavement in the street who points out the emperor's naked. And that's a classic instance of how a child's wisdom is greater than adult intelligence. Adults can be fooled. Adults, are so desperate to be sophisticated and mature that they can end up swallowing all sorts of nonsense. But a child's purity of heart, in that sense, is precisely what a fairy tale, if it's done well, communicates and recaptures. And that's one of the reasons why adults should read fairy tales as much as children. But a further reason why, in the case of the Narnia Chronicles, that they are worth reading in adulthood is that C.S. Lewis was a brilliant writer. They're much more than just simple fables. They're much longer than, a typical sort of Aesop fable. They're, several hundred pages each. And in the Chronicles, Lewis is able to give what is ostensibly a very simple and attractive, magical fairy tale land with adventures and giants and dragons and chases and adventures and so on, which a child of 7 will appreciate and find, a great rollicking read. But because Lewis was steeped in Western literature and mythology and was one of the greatest literary critics of his day, he was able at the same time to embed any amount of, well, first of all, just scriptural and literary allusions. So there's a lot of biblical parallels, and you might even say allegory working in these books. And then there's an additional level, which is what I stumbled across when I was doing my PhD, which is this planetary scheme. The 7 heavens and their symbolic values are what Lewis is really using as his kind of imaginative blueprint for each of the Narnia books.
Great. And I might just pick up one thing on, you brought up the cosmology of Narnia, and then we might go to our first piece of music, which would be appropriate after that. But I read somewhere that C.S. Lewis had said that with the sort of the Copernican revolution, in a certain sense, we lost more than we gained. And he said, obviously, we couldn't keep the medieval cosmology because the single problem with it was that it wasn't actually true. And I put this to one of the previous guests to sit in your seat, who was Brother Guy Consolmagno, the director of the Vatican Observatory. And he was firmly of the opinion, no, we gained far more, by the modern view of the world. And yet I can't help but find myself siding a little bit with Lewis, and I wondered what you felt and what it is about the medieval cosmology that sort of makes things more alive, and what it teaches us.
Yeah, I think Lewis thought that the medieval cosmos was valuable because it was still an enchanted cosmos. It was still a cosmos in which quality as well as quantity figured and was significant. He says, he writes quite a lot about this in his academic book, The Discarded Image. The image that we've discarded is this old pre-Copernican geocentric cosmology, with the Earth at the center, surrounded by the heavens, and the sun going around the Earth not going around the sun. That's the image we've discarded. We no longer believe the universe to be like that, and that's an advance. Lewis isn't a Luddite. He's fully cognizant of the fact that science advances, and that's a good thing. What's a bad thing is that there's a kind of mythology that follows in the wake of science, he says. And here he's using mythology in a bad sense. The Copernican revolution has ushered in, quite sort of irrelevantly, he says, a sort of reductionist and materialist, quantitative mindset, where the only question that's now worth asking about the heavens, or the planets, is where are they, and what are they made of, and how quickly do they move, and how old are they, and these questions about quantity and function. And the separate alternative set of questions that you could ask, like Well, why have they been made? Who made them? Who were they made for? What do they signify? Those questions about purpose and personality and function and meaning no longer figure in the scientific mindset. And that's the bad thing that Lewis is putting his finger on, saying that's regrettable. He says in the olden days, astronomy and astrology were basically one discipline, and the same people who asked the how and the what questions were also prepared to ask the why and the who questions. Whereas since the Copernican revolution, astronomy has become ever more this hard-headed, quantitative, mathematical, materialistic science, and astrology has devolved into being nothing more than a kind of superstitious nonsense. Whereas astrology, in the proper sense, in the true sense of the word, is not any sort of silly thing. Astrology just means studying the stars, and there's nothing wrong about studying the stars, because the stars and the planets and the whole entire cosmos have been made by God for a purpose, and we, with our intelligence, want to understand that in every possible dimension. And so what's happened since the 16th, 17th century and the scientific revolution has been this great bifurcation, and the two sides of the human mind, as it were, the quantitative and the qualitative, are ever more separate from each other, and that's led to a kind of very regrettable intellectual schizophrenia.
Thank you. And I think we're going to go to our first piece of music now, which you have chosen, which appropriately, given what we've just been discussing, is the Holst's Planet Suite, and I think you said a favourite was the Jupiter movement. Do you want to just say a little bit about why you chose that? Or I like it is a perfectly valid reason, but if there was anything more you wanted to say.
Well, I do like it very much. As it happens, C.S. Lewis thought that the Jupiter movement wasn't very good. He liked the Planet Suite as a whole, but he thought the Jupiter movement and the folk tune at the heart of this movement was insufficiently regal for his conception of the kingly Jupiter. But although Lewis didn't much like Holst's interpretation of Jupiter, Lewis loved Jupiter and Jupiter's symbolism more generally, both in medieval and in classical literature and art. Jupiter is the king, he says, but we must think of a king at peace, enthroned, taking his leisure, serene, tranquil, festive, magnanimous. When this planet dominates, he says, we may expect halcyon days and prosperity. He's the best planet. He's called Fortuna Major in medieval thought. And that kingly symbol, Lewis thought, had almost evaporated from the modern imagination. And it was Lewis's great hope to reanimate it, to revivify it in the modern imagination. One of the things he's doing in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is to structure the entire book, I believe, out of this jovial symbol.
So you're listening to Radio Maria, and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio today by Father Michael Ward, and we're discussing all things C.S. Lewis. I don't know, the conversation might stray into some Tolkien as well, and that wouldn't be a terrible thing. But Father Michael had just been in the last segment sort of speaking a little bit about the cosmology of Narnia, and the way that the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is sort of set on Jupiter. And I have to say, as I read in your book, then had me looking back at various sections and various moments of like, oh yeah, of course, and the cosmology. Well, once you'd spotted it, I wouldn't say once I spotted it, but once you'd spotted it for me, it does make tremendous sense and enhanced going back to passages in the book. So thank you for that. And one of the things that I was thinking when we were speaking about sort of reading Lewis as an adult, and in fact the way that the genre of fairy wasn't invented in like for children but made its way in there, was this sort of difference that Lewis speaks at one point about, I think, enjoyment and contemplation. He speaks about the difference between looking along a shaft of light versus seeing the shaft of light.
Yeah, that's a hugely important distinction in Lewis's whole understanding of how we know things. We can either look at a subject from, as it were, outside, looking at it neutrally, dispassionately, without any sort of personal involvement. We're just inspecting it from a sort of distance, with our arms crossed, putting it under a microscope, or for that matter, looking at it through a telescope. That's one way in which we know things, and that's fine. And he calls that contemplation. But there's also enjoyment, which is when we're not holding the thing at arm's length, but we're allowing ourselves to be embraced by it. We are embracing it, as it were. We're stepping into the beam of light. We're looking along the beam of light. And what you know from within may be significantly different from what you can see from without. And Lewis thought that this distinction was a really indispensable tool of thought in really every department of life. And it's relevant to what we've been saying about the Narnia Chronicles, because when you're reading a book, you are apt, if you're not careful, just to contemplate. You look at the characters doing the things in the story. You look at what is presented on the page, in terms of the sort of the data points, and you may not necessarily be aware that the story, if it's at all well told, if the author knows his business, is not just giving you a clever plot, but also an atmosphere, a world, a sort of three-dimensional atmosphere or tone or flavour, which enfolds every part of the story, the characters and the plot and the background details, and everything conspires to generate this tone or flavour, what Lewis calls the kappa element, the cryptic element. It's hidden from you while you read because you're inside it. You're not looking at it, you're looking along it. It's the whole field of vision in which you experience the story. There are some stories, he says, which are, don't have much atmosphere. He criticises the Three Musketeers, for instance, for being all plot and no atmosphere. So the characters go from London to Paris, he says, and Paris is no different from London. It's just a backdrop. It's like the two-dimensional flats on a stage. But a great novelist will give you a believable world with a sort of oxygen that you can breathe in, and you want to return to those stories, not because you've forgotten what happens. You can remember the plot all right, but the plot, after a while, is not your main concern. You just like going back to these stories because you like living in that imaginative space. In other words, you like enjoying that beam of light that the author gives you access to. And so in Narnia, if my theory is right, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe gives us a jovial story, a jovial atmosphere. And Prince Caspian gives us a martial atmosphere. It admits us to the symbolism of Mars. And the Dawn Treader, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, is written according to the symbolism of the sun. All those solar characteristics of gold and wisdom and illumination and dragons and that whole matrix of qualities. And so on 7 times over. That's what Lewis was up to when he wrote the Narnia books. And although some people have criticised them for being a bit of a hodgepodge, when you come at them from this planetary perspective, all those apparent oddities make excellent sense. You can see exactly the sort of poetic logic that Lewis was working to.
Mm. And with sort of children's stories, it hadn't occurred to me until reading about what Lewis was saying about sort of creating a mood and an atmosphere, the way that you read a child a book, and if it's a good book, the moment it's finished, they're like, again. Mm. And there's something sort of sad in adulthood that we always seem desperate for the new, and we sort of get quite bored. And I wrote a little bit about this in my dissertation on Achadia, which I wanted at one point to introduce the wind and the willows and Mr. Toad as the sort of great example of a Chadian, that like this is the next great thing, and then he very quickly gets bored of it, and then it's like motor cars are going to be the next great thing, and he gets bored, and then flying, albeit, and nothing actually satisfies. Whereas a child is able to delight in something that is good again and again and again, and I just know for myself I need to recapture something of that. And his distinction between sort of contemplation and enjoyment made me also think in terms of my role as a preacher, and I'd interested whether you have any thoughts or similar difficulties, because sometimes whenever I'm reading the scriptures or whenever I'm reading some theology, my mind is always like, well, how am I going to preach that? What am I going to say about that? And I can find it difficult to just be in it. I don't know whether you have that difficulty ever yourself. You're always thinking, what will I lecture about this, or what will I preach about this?
Well, it is a problem, isn't it, for anybody whose, as it were, job is to use any text, whether it's the Bible for a preacher, or in my case, when I'm continually speaking and writing about C.S. Lewis, if you're not careful, the book, the text, the art, whatever it is, just becomes a quarry from which you are, continually wanting to mine your next presentation for. It's interesting you mentioned The Wind in the Willows, Father Toby, because that is a beautiful book, and it's one I reread almost every summer. C.S. Lewis loved it, actually, and quotes from it in The Problem of Pain. But I think if we're looking for an atmosphere in The Wind in the Willows, it's or a theme, it's the theme of return, of homecoming. You remember how the mole throws down his brushes in a fit of pique when he's fed up with spring cleaning and goes off. But then later in the book, he gets a scent of his own burrow, and he's desperate to go back. It moves him to tears. And likewise, Ratty, he gets possessed at one point by this romantic dream of adventure when he sees this seafaring rat, and he gets lost in these sort of self-indulgent dreams of going to the South Seas. But then the mole very cunningly, cleverly brings him back to his senses and his first love, which is writing poetry things. And so the rat comes back to his true self. And in the character of Mr. Toad, it's sort of transposed into a kind of comic key, isn't it? Because Mr. Toad, as you say, is always looking for the next best thing, whether it be, motor cars or narrow boats or whatever it may be. And then when he does come back to his own ancestral home, Toad Hall, he finds that it's been invaded by the stoats and the weasels. and then his friends, Ratty and Mole, and indeed Mr. Badger, who know about the value of home, recapture it for him. And so Mr. Toad is himself brought back to his proper place. So I think there's this beautiful, very cleverly done theme of homecoming and return in The Wind in the Willows, which speaks precisely to the point you're raising about keeping things fresh. You do have to go away a little bit from home in order to see it in its true perspective, but if it's at all valuable, it's something that you want to revert to whenever you reasonably can.
And I think that has been part of the beauty of reading Narnia for me, was, as Lewis said, he was writing more of a supposal than an allegory, and by meaning a supposal of what might the incarnation have looked like in a different universe to ours, and that was quite powerful. So moments, particularly with Eustace Clarence Scrubb and his what seemingly more obvious allegory in some ways, but the baptism. But I preached on that for the Epiphany, and about him having a moment of self-realization, of realizing who he was and that he was powerless to do anything about it without actually the painful sort of clawing of almost like the third baptism. And so I found Lewis hugely helpful for making the gospel sort of come alive to me, and actually sort of Christian teaching on grace and our inability to do things by ourselves.
And I'm sure he would be delighted to hear you say that, because that's one of his purposes in writing the Narnia books. He says that What disabled much of his own religion in childhood was an obligation to feel such and such a way about, say the sufferings of Christ or whatever it may be. And he said that inhibited rather than encouraging the appropriate emotion, because he says an obligation to feel can freeze feelings. But how if you take the story of Christ and throw it into a magical realm like Narnia, freeing it from its stained glass and Sunday school associations, could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons of religious inhibition, of obligation, and make Christianity, perhaps for the first time, appear in its real potency, so that the readers will, as it were, get inside the meaning of the story? And again, here we come back to contemplation and enjoyment, not just look at it from outside, as a dry and dusty set of religious facts about which you are supposed to feel such and such, but you get plunged into it and it becomes alive. And then it's very natural to have these emotional and imaginative responses. That's the whole purpose of art, of good Christian art.
Thank you. I'm going to change tack slightly now, because hopefully I think if you're not persuaded now that you ought to read Narnia as an adult, I'm not sure what more Father Michael can do for you. I'm sure you are persuaded. But a book that's certainly not for children, because it really is pretty difficult reading in some ways, is C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And I know you've recently written a very helpful commentary on that, sort of published by Word on Fire, and I started reading The Abolition of Man again, guided by your commentary, and then decided that I would use it for the text with my reading group at King's College London this year, and we had some really fruitful discussions. But I wondered if you could say a little bit about what prompted you to write this book on the abolition of man, and anything about our current time that seemed to make you think now's the time to do it.
Well, I was asked originally to write a foreword to The Abolition of Man for a new edition that was being prepared by a publisher in the States. And so I wrote a foreword, and it grew and it grew and it grew rather unexpectedly into a sort of commentary on everything in the book, because The Abolition of Man is quite a short book, but very dense and deep. So I ended up with what was effectively a commentary, and the foreword was never published at all. And then Word on Fire Academic came along and said, "Oh, we'll publish it as a standalone book." And it's called After Humanity, and I'm very pleased to know that it's of use to you and your students, because The Abolition of Man is a difficult book. I find it difficult. I'm not a philosopher, but it's Lewis's most philosophical work. It originated as 3 philosophy lectures that he gave at the University of Durham during the Second World War. And it's all about objective value, whether value, goodness, truth, beauty, whether value is something real and substantial out there in the universe that we have to recognize and, as it were, conform ourselves to, or whether value is purely subjective, something we project from our own inner tastes and whims and appetites and willpower. And Lewis is defending the objectivity of value. He says if we give up on the objectivity of value, we'll be, as it were, erasing an important part, a vital part, an essential part of our own humanity. And that's why his book is called The Abolition of Man. We'll be abolishing an aspect of our humanity if we give up on the objectivity of value. Objective value is necessary, essential to any proper discourse or conversation that you might have with another person. That you can only properly disagree with someone if you and your interlocutor both agree about the objective reality of the thing you're disagreeing about. But if it's all subjective projection, why do we bother to talk to each other at all, even to disagree with people? It's absolutely vital to retain it, even though it can be inconvenient at times. And indeed, the inconvenience of value is what shows us its true objectivity, when we have to suffer for instance, the good, or when an artist has to suffer for his art. or, when someone has to tell the truth in a court of law, even if it's against their own interests, that's because we're all recognizing the objective reality of the thing under discussion. And unless we're prepared to pay a price for the objectivity of the thing we're talking about, then we're effectively giving up on our own humanity. We're saying we're devolving down into either the subhuman or evaporating up into a kind of false spirituality.
And one of the things that Lewis seems to find particularly sort of insidious is the way that the undermining of the objectivity of value, the objectivity of aesthetics is just sort of slipped in there. In that there's a sort of a book and a phrase sort of innocuous on the face of it, a children's literature textbook, and yet within it contains a whole philosophical worldview just sort of slipped in there. And I was listening to a couple of mothers on the bus yesterday and being quite brave actually about resisting a transgender sort of ideology with the things that their children were being sort of fed at school, and just little things that it would seem you needed to think this is just being a nice person, but actually which contain a much bigger worldview within them.
Yes, that literature textbook that you just referenced is how Lewis starts The Abolition of Man. He calls this textbook the Green Book, and he finds fault with it because it as you say, it slips in, it smuggles in a subjectivist attitude. This book, the Green Book, Lewis calls it, talks about the episode when the poet Coleridge was at a waterfall, and the authors of this book say, was the waterfall sublime or was it merely pretty? Coleridge thought it was sublime, but another tourist thought it was just pretty, and neither of them was right, because it's whatever you choose to say it is. And that's Lewis's springboard into his whole case about the importance of objective value. And perhaps this is a good point at which to mention the second choice of piece of music that I've selected, the Ennio Morricone piece, because this the way the Abolition of Man opens with a discussion of a waterfall put me in mind of that great movie The Mission, and the Iguazu Falls in South America, where the film is set. As I was writing my guide to The Abolition of Man, Ennio Morricone, the great Italian composer, died, unfortunately, and as a result of the news of his death, I started rewatching The Mission and re-listening to Morricone's great soundtrack to that movie. And at the start of the movie, you see a man on a cross, a missionary, a Jesuit, not a Dominican, and he's being crucified, and he's on this cross, and he's going down a river, and then you see him go over the falls, the waterfalls, which is a great example of the objectivity of value taken to the absolute extreme, dying for the faith. And later on in the movie, the Jeremy Irons character says that if might is right, love can have no place in the world. If it's just a question of your own willpower as to whether a thing is right or wrong, then there can be no love. It's just everything devolves into an assertion of power. And so this whole sort of constellation of topics about waterfalls and value and love and C.S. Lewis and Ennio Morricone has led me to make this choice of my second piece of music.
Great, and you dedicated the book to Ennio Morricone.
I did, yes. Alas, I never met him, but in his memory, After Humanity is dedicated, yeah.
So let's have a listen to that now. we're delighted to be joined by Father Michael Ward here in the London studio, and we've been talking about C.S. Lewis. But now I'd like to sort of introduce his great friend Tolkien, and one of the things I've done in the last couple of weeks with my students, which has been very fruitful. Been listening to a podcast on the Inklings by an Anglican vicar in the US who references you quite a lot, and thinking about the friendship and how important intentional friendship is. And with the reading group, I've now started asking people, not just for me to bring a text, but for them to bring something that's impacted them in the last week, or if it hasn't happened in the last week because they've been revising maybe this term, and people have brought along some wonderful pieces. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about the relationship between Lewis and Tolkien.
Yes, if Lewis and Tolkien hadn't met each other and become friends, it's quite possible, I think, that we would not have heard of either man, because it was largely through Tolkien's influence that C.S. Lewis became an adult Christian, that he returned to his childhood faith, as he did in his early 30s, largely as a consequence of a long conversation that he had with Tolkien. And if Lewis hadn't become a Christian, he would probably have been quite a prominent academic, but probably only Oxford academics would ever have heard of him. He wouldn't have written Mere Christianity and Narnia books and so forth. And if Tolkien hadn't met Lewis, if they hadn't become such friends, then it's distinctly possible that Tolkien would never have written The Lord of the Rings, or at least never completed it and published it. Tolkien said that it was only Lewis's endless encouragement, driven at points to the level of nagging, that ever convinced him, Tolkien, that there would be an audience for the kind of thing he was writing. So, in a sense, we owe The Lord of the Rings to C.S. Lewis, in part, not just Tolkien. It shows you the value of friendship and collaboration and encouragement there. I wonder if the Anglican chap you mentioned with his podcast, is that Brian McGreevy?
It is. Yeah. That is the one.
I wondered. Yes, I've come across his work myself in the last year. In fact, he very kindly had me out to speak at a conference in Charleston, South Carolina, earlier this year. And it's interesting that he's an Anglican, I'm a Catholic priest, but we got on like a house on fire, and rather like the Anglican Lewis and the Catholic Tolkien. It's a good example of ecumenism. And I've learnt a lot about Tolkien's attitude to Anglicans and his ecumenical attitudes in general, thanks to reading a draft of a new biography of Tolkien that's coming out later this year by my friend and colleague Holly Ordway. She's written this book, Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography. And again, it's being published by Word on Fire Academic, coming out just before the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death, which will be this September. And Holly's done a great job in unearthing all sorts of interesting aspects to Tolkien's path of faith. Because he actually started out an Anglican. His parents were Anglican, and his mother entered the Catholic Church when Tolkien was 8, and then Tolkien was confirmed just before he was 12. And then his mother, alas, died, so Tolkien was an orphan by the time he was 12. And then he was under the guardianship of an Oratorian priest in Birmingham until he became an adult. So he was effectively a junior inmate, he says, of the Oratory House in Birmingham, raised by this community of priests who had been brought to Birmingham by John Henry Newman, Saint John Henry Newman, as we should now call him. And Tolkien, although he had patches when he struggled with his faith, lived a very devout Catholic life for the rest of his life. And The Lord of the Rings, and indeed The Hobbit, and everything that Tolkien wrote are deeply infused with his Catholic faith, though in a different way from the way that Narnia is infused with Lewis's faith. Tolkien was less allegorically minded. He was more, as it were, subtle. He imbued his magical world more indirectly with religious and spiritual and Christian themes. But they are definitely there, and Tolkien himself said that The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. And what Holly Ordway's book does so well is to give you all the biographical background, establishing the utter centrality and importance of Tolkien's faith to his life, and therefore to his works. So I'd encourage everybody to pre-order Holly's book. It's already available on Amazon. It's coming out in late August.
There you go. And you've not encouraged us to buy your own book and even to buy somebody else's. It's very, very magnanimous of you. But I'd encourage you to buy Father Michael's books as well, because they're well worth it. On the subject of books, just in the little time we had left, I wondered if we had any recommendations. You spoke about sort of Tolkien being more subtle in his Christianity. In The Lord of the Rings, that say the child or the adult who comes across The Lord of the Rings maybe through the films for the first time, then decides to read the book, but hasn't grown up in a Christian culture. These things resonate with something deep inside them, but not in a way that they have any Christian language to describe. Are there any books that you would suggest going to, or any sort of stepping stones which might not have been as necessary in the time of Lewis and Tolkien but are now?
Well, aside from Holly's book, there's a lot of material out there, actually, when you begin looking. Stratford Caldecott, the late Stratford Caldecott, wrote a very good book called Secret Fire, which unpacks a lot of the Christian imagery in Tolkien's fiction. And Ralph Wood has written a book called The Gospel According to Tolkien. Those are two that I would recommend. They're both worth looking at, and they will lead people to many other works and articles on this subject. It's a very rich vein to mine. And if I may plug a piece that I wrote myself, I've written an article called Peak Middle-earth, Why Mount Doom is Not the Climax of The Lord of the Rings. That's available online. It was published in an online journal called An Unexpected Journal. And I there myself talk about the hidden climax of The Lord of the Rings, which amazes me. It hasn't received as much attention as it ought to, because Tolkien himself described it as this scene as the peak of the whole music, as it were, of The Lord of the Rings. But everybody focuses on other things, like the destruction of the ring, or the coronation of Aragorn, or the homecoming of Sam, or the departure of Frodo. But the real climax of The Lord of the Rings is when the two hobbits, Frodo and Sam, are praised on the field of Cormallen. And that's what my article is all about.
Fascinating. And one final question, given we got on popular culture. I read somewhere that Netflix have bought the rights to the entirety of Narnia. Do you know anything about that, and you're going to try to get involved as a theological consultant?
Actually, I don't know anything about it, no. And I don't have very high hopes. I didn't think very much, I'm afraid to say, of the three feature films that have already been made of the first of the three Narnia books. So I don't hold out many hopes.
I didn't think much either. Not especially high hopes, but it shows something about this enduring value of Lewis and Tolkien, that there's something that they're writing about which keeps people going back to it, mining it in a way which hasn't happened with other writers of their period. And I heard Germaine Greer apparently said that sort of my biggest worry is that the most famous person from my time at Oxford is going to turn out to be sort of Tolkien or Lewis. And it came true.
It has come true, yes, absolutely. They are now an established two-headed monster for people like Germaine Greer, or a pair of saintly twins from a more positive perspective. They are, I think, for the 20th century what Wordsworth and Coleridge were to the 19th century. They're absolute giants.
Great. Well, Father Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. We're just going to close now with the final piece of music you chose, which is Haydn's The Heavens Are Telling. And would you like to introduce that and say goodbye to our listeners at the same time.
Yes, I chose this because obviously the heavens are telling the glory of God is the opening line of Psalm 19. But C.S. Lewis described Psalm 19 as the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. And given that so much of my own work has been on cosmology and the symbolism and the significance of the planets, I thought that this would be a good note to go out on. It's also a rollicking good piece of music.
Okay, Father Michael Ward, thank you so much.
Thank you.